Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Five podcast. Today I am joined again by Right Ruminations to discuss the genealogical origins of the left. So why don't you lay it out for us, Right Ruminations?
Well, when I first became aware of Jordan Peterson, I guess in 2016, when most other people became aware of him, he was really fixating on postmodernity and relativism as an essential characteristic of the left. And this is something that I had thought at one time. It kind of sounds like what you hear a lot of neo-scholastics in Catholic circles talking about. But it seemed to me that I had arrived at a point where that was unconvincing because, for one thing, the left is not really relativistic in the sense that it doesn't really admit of any kind of intellectual anarchy of the kind that you would associate with somebody like Firebend. It really does have its own kind of, if not universal, then at least idea of objective moral values. And this idea that you hear from people like the Straussians or Jordan Peterson, that the left is about deconstructing these universal forms or habits of action, doesn't seem to do justice to the authoritarian nature of the left. Now, there are postmoderns and there are people who definitely use relativistic language on the left. But the idea that the right is pro-moral authority and the left is anti-moral authority really does a disservice to the extent to which political correctness is involved. It almost seems like it's a kind of a hangover or carryover from like rhetoric from the 80s. With like the moral majority and Ronald Reagan and like the Christian right and things of that nature, which have a point. I mean, insofar as they're critiquing relativism, but not necessarily insofar as they're attributing relativism to the left. So I guess the question that's before us is, to what extent is the left morally deconstructive, or to what extent is it morally constructive? And in a similar way, to what extent is it really relativistic? Or on the other hand, to what extent is it simply an alternative set of moral authoritarian positions, which simply seeks to rework what had been there before? Another word about this is that I think that often in keeping with Jordan Peterson's kind of limits as an autodidact, it really detracts from the groundwork laid out by the Frankfurt School and the cultural Marxists, and puts an undue emphasis on things like literary theory that you have attributed to people like Michel Foucault, or the name of one of the other major French.
Derrida.
Yes, exactly. Derrida. Thank you. And this emphasis that you see placed by Republicans, by Jordan Peterson, and by conservatives more generally, seeks as a kind of distraction to an extent from the constructive origins and the constructive philosophy more generally of the left as I see it. And this is often something that the left itself has attested to. Herbert Marcuse actually rejected the term postmodernism in favor of late modernity, because he wanted to maintain the sense of universal constructs, of not just having everything floating in intellectual anarchy. And I was rather happy to hear on a show that Paul Gottfried remained consistent in his position that the left was indeed more oriented towards collectivism and cultural Marxism than it was towards relativism or moral deconstructionism. And this was a grounds which he also saw as grounds for criticism of Dr. Peterson. And it was very refreshing to hear somebody finally kind of mirror my own thoughts on that. these are the parameters of the discussion at hand, as I understand it.
Well, I think part of this confusion is what is the left? And that's not an easy question to answer, because even those on the left have a hard time defining what the left is. But broadly speaking, within what is the left, there is the authoritarian left and the anti-authoritarian left. And I think you could argue that the authoritarian left, whether it's Jacobinism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, Maoism, does tend to have this more moralistic, absolute value system to it. Whereas the libertarian left, you think of like the beatniks and the hippies from the 50s and 60s and 70s, up through certain anarchist strains, don't necessarily have that. And the point to your issue about the rhetoric, the 1990s were kind of this wild west of regulating culture. So the religious consensus was breaking down in the 80s against smut and things like that. And it was kind of anything could go. And a lot of these liberalists, libertarians, new atheists, fedora types are nostalgic for the 90s in light of the new censorship of the left. But it's a really unique, non-repeatable era where one way of looking at the world was being deconstructed, if you will, by these sorts of what we might call degenerate media in order to pave the way for the new one. Because, nature abhors a vacuum. There will always be an order imposed. Who is going to impose it's the only question. And if we look at for example, I've been looking into the idea of post-left anarchism. Now, of course, they say they're not left-wing. They tend to hit their cues from Nietzsche and Stirner. And they criticize the left as just that, a moralistic dinosaur that seeks to yoke its followers to a kind of absolute moral principle, whether it's the revolution or workers' justice or racial justice or whatever, rather than individual autonomy. So I think in part, if you look at the individual autonomy left, the libertarian left, the sort of deconstructionist nihilism becomes, I think, a more tenable claim. But if it's the more authoritarian left, that's not at all as clear. And I think also deconstruction is a technique. So you could be an authoritarian leftist, use the technique of deconstruction against your opponent, but then not use it against yourself. The problem is there are some leftists that go so deep down the rabbit hole that their entire ideology is deconstructionist. And it's no longer just a tactic, but a gestalt. So, there's that difference as well. So I think, in short, the main issue is how do we define the left? And what might be true of one element of the left isn't necessarily true of the other side.
Well, I think that building on what you're saying, that the left and we touched on this. We covered this for an hour in the last roundtable discussion. But in drawing from that, what I would say is it's not a question of whether the left is essentially deconstructive or constructive. Rather, if the left is something we can kind of define as being progressivism more generally or anti-traditionalism, the question is, obviously, since that can present itself both deconstructively and constructively, I think the real question is, phenomenologically speaking, sort of apart from how we define the left, how does the left actually manifest itself in real world experience? So you can have a left that's deconstructive or constructive. The question is, which does it tend to be? And I think that what the left is doing now is that it's showing its true colors. So let's say if in the 2000s, you might have had people with political persuasion similar to ours who felt the need to oppose the left on an almost intuitive basis because they could sense that there was something not amiss about it. So even though the left may have claimed to support open-mindedness, freedom of speech, live and let live, and so forth. There was a kind of subconscious sense that I remember experiencing that wouldn't last, that they weren't entirely upfront about that was not really what they were about. Now, I think some of them were about that. And I actually am relatively favorable towards those ones who will be consistent in that regard, not because I'm a fedora type or a relativist, but because culturally and intellectually speaking, I believe in I have views that are congruous with their desire for methodological individualism. But nevertheless, I think that it's not so much were the people on the left or the left of center in the 90s or the 2000s legitimately deconstructive. The question is, was the direction in which history was moving, was the actual zeitgeist of the left, was the powers that be who were pushing the left, did they really value these rhetorical devices you're talking about of unfreezing the existing culture? And I think we're seeing that at least a good number of them who wielded a fair amount of power, or perhaps something internally in the ideology of itself, was not really as deeply oriented towards deconstructivism or individualism as we thought. But I think that it's a good way of understanding this is to kind of separate the question of whether the left is constructive or deconstructive from definitional concerns, because I guess metaphysically speaking or definitionally speaking, the left could go either way. The question is, does it in practice?
Exactly. I also would tend to agree that the 90s rhetoric and early 2000s rhetoric of the left struck me as hollow. And we sort of see the proof with the mass defection of the left to being corporatist whores for globalism. They spent all of the 80s, all of the 90s, the first decade of the 2000s, culminating in Occupy Wall Street, with a 30-year anti-globalist message. And all of a sudden they flip just because of a few woke corporations. I mean, that really tells you, and it's a universal flip. There's not a single person except maybe Slavoj Žižek that's really seriously combating this. So you could look at that. And I would tend to say that the political American left, those that are involved in media, film, politics, the universities, they use deconstruction as a technique rather than as an end state. I mean, there might be some kooky academics that are just deconstructionists for the sake of deconstructionists. But, I guess maybe that's what, postmodernism is from the point of view of Jordan Peterson. But, yeah, in hindsight, it seems clear that they were trying to roll out a system. But they weren't being honest. They said they were just against the injustice of what they perceived to be the traditional order, and then deconstructed it. But they never actually told you what they wanted to replace it with. So when it actually was deconstructed and nothing was left, then they could just impose whatever they wanted. And it started happening around 2016, 2017. And that's when a lot of the YouTube culture kind of like, what just happened here?
You know what it kind of reminds me of, and something that sort of set alarm bells ringing in my head at the time, is when I was in high school, it always really irked me, the irony of all of the, basically popular in crowd who, wore all of the latest fashions and had the latest political opinions, and were basically the kind of stereotypical high status circle, were the ones who were parodying the nerd is the new cool talking point, because they watched The Big Bang Theory or whatever, and it almost is kind of like that, that these people would be, it's almost like having these mega corporations who, if they thought that it could help them turn a profit or meet whatever end, would actually, will produce movies that aggrandize communist journalists and things of that nature. That there is this it almost reminds me of the South Park episode where they're singing this song and they say that you have to do what you want to do as long as what you want to do is what's cool and popular with everyone else. And so I think that with the left's pretenses to supporting freedom of speech, to supporting the underdog, to supporting that which was genuinely unpopular, it's analogous to the people in the in crowd claiming to be these kind of nerd low status advocates in a similar in a way that's analogous to exactly how they supported freedom of speech and critical thinking. Well, that's great as long as you don't actually do it, and except in cases where freedom of speech is actually being exercised. But I think while it was still fresh, there might have been people who would be a little more consistent with it. But of course, these ideas, they really can be tested only when there's some actual genuine conflict in play, right? It's all well and good to say that you support like the nerds or the people on the out, as long as they're holding all of your same political views. Well, in a way analogous to that, that's something Gamergate pointed out, but it's analogous to that. It's one thing to say, I support freedom of speech, I support critical thought, I support open-mindedness, until you actually realize that there are people who have serious disagreements with you and want to state them.
Oh, yeah, totally. Exactly. I think one of the things, if you mentioned also, what does the left do in practice? And also we can't just look at the past 15, 20 years, but really the past 200 years, going back to people like Godwin and Proudhon. And when you look at these left-wing writers, they'll talk about the need to destroy existing institutions, but none of them will ever describe day 2 after the revolution. This is something that Slavoj Žižek pointed out recently in his discussion with Tyler Cowen. It's like there is no replacement for the order that they seek to replace. And because the left works in coalitions until the tankies come in and kill everyone, one could look at that as a failure of the libertarian left. They're good at deconstructing, but they're not so good at coming up with an alternative. And then when that fails to materialize, the authoritarian left takes over and says, "Okay, we're gonna do what we think is best," and that usually just happens to be whatever the dictator of the month decides is best.
Right. Now, to sort of say something in favor of the deconstructive left, what I would say is that one of the things that I do think that William F. Buckley, who was a very mainstream conservative in the 20th century, was very well known, said that conservatism ought to be about finding the source of the chaos at a given time and then trying to root that out. The meaning of that being, I guess, not advance a positive ideology. And I am sympathetic to that, in that if the left were to have actually come out and said, like the Marxists or the French revolutionaries, we don't just want to deconstruct these things or address this or that injustice, but we actually have this original vision that we want to introduce into society, and they actually did go into depth about what step 2 was, that life might actually be significantly worse right now. So I think that, much like you might say that the dissident right might have as its most justifiable task identifying the current source of chaos, which is cultural Marxism at the moment, and then saying, well, we're going to oppose that. It might actually be more dangerous to articulate what step 2 looks like, because then, various intense ideas of step 2 might be able to become more popular that way, whether they be National Socialism or neo-reaction or any number of unpalatable ideas. So in that sense, I have to say that relative to what it could be, I'm actually thankful that the left did not do a very good job of articulating what step 2 would look like, precisely because if they did, the more authoritarian excesses of their vision might be even more secure now than they are currently, and I think that their relative openness or rhetorical nihilism from the 90s and 2000s actually may be working in our favor, because it has a lot of liberals and like kind of like people like the skeptics saying, now wait a minute, hold on, this isn't what you were saying 2 seconds ago. So that is an angle that I think we should consider.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not saying I wish the left was more explicit in its details. I'm glad as well that it wasn't, because the Soviet state was horrendous. But there's another element too, though, in which the left is the confusion between constructive and deconstructive left arises. So, for example, in Spain during the Civil War, the Popular Front, which included anarchists, left liberals, Trotskyists, and Stalinists, they all said they wanted the same end state, you know, the stateless, classless, moneyless, propertyless utopia. But the thing is, they all sort of agreed on the big ideas that they shared. But what they didn't agree on was, one, how to get there, and two, what kind of institutions, if any, would be the kind of institutions that would preserve the values they advocate. And I think that is a big part of the confusion.
That is a part of the confusion, and I mean, the left is able to do that seemingly, and to maintain some kind of moral vision. That they are able to work towards a certain end while still being ecumenical after a fashion. Now, they're not ecumenical in the sense that they'll tolerate deviations of speech or of political ideology, but I guess you might say that they are better at being coalitional than the right. And this is something that I regret that the right can't do. And I think that maybe one of the reasons that the right can't do this is that the left has learned the value of oppositional rhetoric. So even when they really do have some very harsh vision of outcome, because they are opposed to the existing order or to the traditional order, they are able to better follow William F. Buckley's, you might say, counter-ideological advice of being in opposition to some specific thing. And I think that the right might benefit from this kind of deconstructive rhetoric, insofar as it would be better able to focus not so much on advocating this or that vision of society, but of advancing coalitional opposition. And here I'm not specifically shilling for the Parthenon. I'm speaking generally in a way that really does apply through various phases in the history of the right and left. I mean, I actually think that Russell Kirk may have been wrong in that actually it may actually be conservatives who are more ideological to their deficit. Now, Kirk may or may not have been right that the right wing should be less, or the conservatives should be less ideological, but I think that the left is able to better simulate the negation of ideology in a way that's able to woo divergent factions, whereas the right, because what it's advocating really has existed in the past, it can lead to a kind of retrograde ideologization of the right, where it just can't be oppositional, whereas the left can be purely oppositional, precisely because it's willing to own this deconstructive rhetoric in the way that the right is not.
One other element that strengthens the left as a movement is when it comes to methods of achieving left-wing ends. Until the tankies turn against the anarchists, they're all in agreement. during the Spanish Civil War or during the Russian Revolution, when the pan-left alliance was in place, the anarchists kind of were like, yeah, okay, the tankies might be a little too heavy-handed, but, they're fighting for equality of the sexes, but they're fighting the capitalists. So we'll go ahead and ignore that. But then eventually, if they defeat the right, then those methods are used against the libertarian socialists, and then they get killed. But so it's both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength for the tankies, but it's a weakness for the libertarian left.
Yeah, it is a weakness in the sense that I guess if you're able to build coalitions, then you expose yourself to what the less desirable members of your coalition want to do after the battle has been won. And you do see that with the behavior of the Stalinists toward the other parts of the Spanish left in the Spanish Civil War. But I mean, what I would say is that's less of a question of whether that. I mean, what I would say is if you're not able to address the source of disturbance at a given time, then you're going to end up with some kind of analogous result anyway. At least if some kind of coalitional opposition is made possible, then at least then you get to the point where you can ask, well, which of these other competing answers is the one that will be prevalent. So I guess it depends on how you assess risks, comparative risks. I mean, the point is that it does seem to help the left take power in one form or another. Whether the parts of the various leftist constituents find that particular form of the left desirable or not is another question.
Well, I just thought of something as we were talking about this. Now, I'm just kind of thinking out loud with this point, but maybe the left is essentially deconstructionist. Because let me explain. We're always complaining about how the left is shifting so rapidly. It's like what was radical left-wing politics the other day is now criticized as being conservative. Slavoj Žižek is a case in point. He hasn't got on board with woke progressivism. He's still a radical leftist, but they think he's a conservative. And I think the reason why the left is always moving to these new goals, they're fluid, they're what Toffler called liquid modernity, they're always changing, is because as soon as something becomes entrenched, the culture of critique kicks in and deconstructs it. So even if they built it, they then end up deconstructing it. And so that then leads to a new consensus. But as soon as that consensus becomes entrenched, that gets deconstructed. So that's why we have this ad nauseum push of the left towards ever and ever more extreme positions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you define a deconstruction. What I would say is that in this technical sense that you've outlined it, that may be true, but it's not deconstructive in a postmodern sense. So this deconstruction is still modern in that it is still advancing some kind of at least ostensibly universal worldview, which has an imperial quality and a crusading element to it. So in other words, even if your positions are all changed from what they were, what it means is that there's a universal desirability of constantly being on the cutting edge and of supporting the evolution of a more and more centralized and regulatory society. So if we're to kind of use Marcuse's standard and his definitions, I think that he was correct in defining his side as being modern as opposed to postmodern. So in a sense, it's deconstructive, but in a sense, it is. I mean, well, once again, if it comes down to the definition of constructive and deconstructive, what I would say is that it's constantly. I think it would be constructive in the sense that it is always trying to build over what is already there. So it's always trying to, you might say, out-construct the latest endeavor. Now, but I will meet you halfway In what I would say is that if you're talking about the cosmic right, the cosmic left, right? Like I defined it last week, like, the far right, the cosmic right is something that probably most people who would see themselves as right wing wouldn't support it. Neither of us would support it. It would be something like the Hindu caste system, right? And then on the far left, you'd have just whatever is the polar opposite of that, right? Like, the wildest dream of some gender studies professor or something, right? I think that maybe what I would say is that the left is not always is not all forms of leftism are deconstructive. But I think that in a cosmic sense, all deconstructivism is left wing. So it's in order to be a true deconstructionist, I think you have to be partly on the left, but that does not mean that all leftists are deconstructive. And I think that the ones we're dealing with right now are constructive, in that even though they're trying to constantly change things, it's always to build something up. It's never with the intention of creating the vacuum.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, I would kind of agree that the left, rather, when they propagandize their position, they never say, we're going to knock down the building and leave it empty. They always promise to build something. It's the actual building that doesn't always happen. And if it does happen, it's almost always done by the authoritarian left. The libertarian left pretty much never builds anything. We can talk about your Barcelonas, you can talk about your Rojavas, but at the end of the day, what do you really have? Nothing. You look at Jacobin France and Leninist Russia, you actually had something. Whether that's good or bad is another question, but they at least built something. And so one thing that even the constructivist take on the left makes it difficult is, of course, when you're dealing with something like the American founding fathers or Mussolini's fascism or the politics of Plato and Aristotle, there's a sort of clearly defined end condition. Like, okay, we want something like this. And once we have it, we're happy, we'll try to keep it. When it talks about all of these, superlatives like classless society, society without poverty or without racism, they can't even really tell you what that looks like, let alone how to get there. And so that puts them in a fundamentally different category than the American founding fathers, Aristotle, Plato, and Mussolini. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that, and this is where the horseshoe theory that the centrists talk about may actually have some validity, is that I think that what the left wants is, and this is, I think, where Jordan Peterson is actually correct, what they want is not a specific outcome, it's an eternal process. But I think it's a process of construction. So let me explain what I mean by that. I think that the reason they don't articulate a final outcome the way you are suggesting is because they don't want to let the moral fervor die down. They always want to have something to be crusading about. They want to have something to be advocating. Now, this doesn't make them any less constructive, because once again, it's always some positive vision that they're advocating, but it's simply a positive vision of agitation. So it's like, it's not a message of leave me alone in this regard. It's a message of don't insist that you be left alone in this regard, that we will tell you what to do, and we will always be coming up with new things to tell you what to do about. So if they were to actually outline a utopia, that would be at cross purposes, because what happens when you reach utopia? Then you run out of steam for the eternal moral crusade. So I think that, and this is where Jordan Peterson is correct, is that it basically is a kind of an accentuation of the human trait of agreeableness, which basically means moral conformity, like people who want everything to be a certain way in every single situation. And it almost doesn't really matter what the particulars are, because, and I've known people like this who I've actually said to them, like there's a sort of odd evangelical acquaintance of mine who for some reason likes the way women dress in Saudi Arabia and thinks that maybe veils and such should be introduced for women publicly in Christianity. But the thing is that and I asked him, but I know for a fact that if women actually started covering their heads in public, that you would find something else that you'd want. And I said, so what would it actually take you to be satisfied? And he looked at me with an expression of utmost earnestness and said, I really don't know. And I think that that's the way the left are, right? Like if you ask them, they don't want to say this is where we would stop because they have no intention of ever stopping. And so in this sense, it's a character trait that they want to elevate above all else, which is moral conformity and moral crusading, which is present in traditional societies. But it's like that detached from all the other elements. And I guess this is tying it back to the horseshoe thing, is that it is a kind of trait that I guess is known to traditional societies. And I guess that one of the reasons that the left can look regressive and the skeptics call it regressive is because it has similar ways of manifesting that particular personality trait in a way that traditional societies sometimes do. But it's also because they've elevated that process. So it's not like they're being like they want agreeableness towards one particular vision of society. Rather, they want a society that just consists of psychological agreeableness and nothing else for its own sake, which is basically a recipe for eternal revolution and perpetual centralization.
Well, what's interesting is in light of the discussion I had with Keith Preston yesterday, when actual leftists meet up, they're anything but agreeable. He told me that he had friends who went to Occupy Wall Street and were like, oh, Keith, you're exaggerating the disagreeableness and pugilistic nature of left-wing activists. And then after Occupy Wall Street, they're like, oh, man, Keith, it was worse than you told us. Also, he says other friends that have stopped going to conferences altogether go there because people just start fights over being misgendered or offending this or that interest group. And so for all of their efforts to achieve agreeableness, it seems to be further away from them than ever before.
The reason I mentioned that in reference to Jordan Peterson is that I meant agreeableness in the technical psychological sense, by which standard they would be highly agreeable in that respect. So agreeable does not mean, in the sense that Peterson uses it, non-aggressive. It does not mean peaceful. It doesn't mean non-agitational. What it means is it's almost like the mama grizzly factor, right? So the people who are complaining and getting triggered about being misgendered and such would, in the technical sense, be a manifestation of agreeableness as it's defined in a non-colloquial sense.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I haven't followed Jordan Peterson recently, so I probably missed that. So looking at the material we've covered thus far, what would you say is the left deconstructionist by nature, constructionist by nature, or schizophrenic by nature?
I think that definitionally speaking, the left is neither. It doesn't have to be either because it's simply opposition to tradition. Now, I will say that that it cannot be entirely constructive, because all forms of deconstructivism, insofar as they're anti-traditional, are anti-left, or are anti-right rather, or they are left. So to the extent that even to which myself support elements of deconstruction in the right, that would be a relatively left-wing tendency. But in terms of how the left actually behaves, in terms of its roots, in terms of its direction, I would have to say that it very much falls down on the side of constructivism. And you see this with the original left, right? The French Revolution, the Jacobins, they were anything but deconstructive. They had a constructive image of society that they wanted to push onto it. And you see the same thing going through with the Russian Revolution. You see it with social justice culture. It's and also when you look at the more immediate antecedents to the modern left, namely postmodernism versus the Frankfurt School. Well, here's the comparison I would lay before you. If you go back and you read Adorno or Marcuse, it could have been written today, a lot of it. Like Adorno's authoritarian personality was written in the 50s. It could have been written in 2016. It opens by saying that we want to re-psychologize people so as to fight the rise of fascism in America. It's just after America won, or was with the one alongside the other Allied forces in World War II. Whereas you take people like Derrida or Foucault, their language is much more remote compared to what the left talk about today. And I think that much of what they said the left would probably decry as Nazism. Like, the things Derrida said, just like casually would say that, flippant things he said about feminism, like try putting a lot of that past the left today. Whereas the things that Adorno and Marcuse and Habermas said are really, they're speaking the language of the left today, or more accurately, the left today is speaking their language. It is not speaking the deconstructive language of a Foucault or a Derrida.
Well, yeah, you made this distinction between specific and more general. So, what I guess you're saying then is the more general the statement, the less constructivist it is, and the more specific the statement, the more constructivist it is.
Yes, that's possible. I mean, it in this case, I'm not sure whether it applies, because it is possible to imagine an alternative reality where people were speaking like Michel Foucault, right, and were using that language, and where the culture was dominated by it. Then at times the left has sounded more like that, right? So it's not that his language is in any way unspecific, or that it couldn't be adapted with the same degree of specificity. It's simply a kind of the phenomenological question of, is that actually where they're taking their specified cues? And I think it's just a different language that they've taken up, but both could be equally specific.
Okay. Yeah. So it's funny. I think you said that Derrida or Foucault would be considered fascist now. Well, Tim was sending me some Facebook messages earlier, and yeah, they're basically saying Foucault is a fascist. So looks like you're already right, Ruminations.
Well, it's funny that I don't remember if it was Feyerabend or somebody else in his ilk in the kind of intellectual anarchism mold, but there was one of these postmodernists who didn't like citations. And it wasn't towards a specific group. He just didn't like citations because he didn't like the appeal to authority, which, that's easy to make fun of, and it probably doesn't lead to the best scholarship, but it is what it is. And my brother was actually in a university course where they were outraged by this, because that meant that, of course, he wasn't able to cite feminist authors. So if you don't cite any authors, how can you cite the authors that you are obligated to cite?
Oh my! Well, it kind of sounds like what you're describing is the perennial image of the snake eating its own tail.
Yes, but I mean, and I'm not going to pretend to know more about them than I do, but there is some appeal to the deconstructive left, in the sense that I'm not sure that they're the same snake entirely. I think that they interlace at times, but I think that they are distinct intellectual strands. And the reason I think that is because you have it on the right as well. You have kind of the reality of different people, basically, whether they're crazy, whether they're sane, whether they're honest, whether they're dishonest. There are people on the left who I think really are intellectually curious and really do desire for some kind of, maybe not to our liking, but some kind of facsimile of the idea of the truth shall set you free. Right now, I know that's a strange thing to say about somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre or people of this ilk, but there is an element of that, right? Like the image of the truth seeker, the image of the person who, even if they deny truth, there's still an element of truth seeking in that. They're trying to open the box intellectually, even if it's then filled with all kinds of contradictions and condescension and so forth. And you could say the same thing about the right with relation to the skeptics today, that there are people who really do seem interested in challenging something for the sake of some kind of intellectual rigor, or at the very least, you might say oppositional curiosity, or interest in opposing fixed orthodoxies. Whereas it seems to me that what makes the Frankfurt School a different snake and therefore not really eating its own tail, is the fact that it has never really presented itself as such, and seems to be entirely original in its vision, and really, you know what? I think that the heirs of cultural Marxism, and maybe even the original cultural Marxists, would be more than happy to bite the snake of postmodernity if it stands in the way of their progressive and collectivist aims.
Probably true, as we saw that hankies destroy the libertarian left time and time again. So would you say, to shift gears a little bit, is there a deconstructionist right?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would like there to be a deconstructivist right, but the problem is, of course, that with the people like the skeptics who claim to be centrists, in an absolute sense, I think are leftists, but maybe in a strategical sense are rightists, like in the kind of Parthenonian sense. I think that even with there's a problem, because of course, if you look at somebody like Sargon, he seemed, or V, I mean, they seem very committed to basically the anti-racist sociological constructs of the cultural Marxists, right? So, like, the idea that these people are these detached truth seekers only goes so far, because, if they were thorough about it, then they would be they would tie themselves less in knots trying to evade the kind of consequences of genuinely entertaining race realist thinking. The fact is that they're not really willing to go there, and in that sense have been preoccupied by at least some of the more intense element of the cultural Marxist constructs. Now, what's funny is that, speaking of transitional periods, I do get the sense that in the early 20-teens, maybe after Ron Paul, maybe, and maybe that left a libertarian flavor in people's mouths. But sort of before Trump and after Ron Paul, it did seem like there was a kind of brief Nietzschean tone in the dissident right. Like, even with, like, if you you perhaps saw with the H.L. Mencken Club, if you remember back when Richard Spencer was still associated with Paul Gottfried and he would interview him. Do you remember that?
Yeah, briefly, yeah.
And they would talk about this, right? They were talking about, like, the possibilities of right-wing deconstructionism, and Paul Gottfried was basically outlining a kind of Nietzschean approach to critique, and Richard Spencer was going along with it. And it wasn't the kind of Nietzschean approach that Richard Spencer ultimately came to embrace, but it was it wasn't so much Nietzsche's politics. It was like the idea of these deconstructing these kind of universal Platonic Christianisms, as they saw it, in favor of something that was more oppositional, that was maybe not nihilistic in the proper sense, but maybe in a sense was politically nihilistic. but that was possessed a kind of anti. I suppose actually might constitute some kind of anti-ideology. So not like Russell Kirk's negate ideology, not like, but not a positive ideology like the neocons or the alt-right came to have, but there's actually an oppositional kind of militancy. Now, unfortunately, that didn't really go that far, and maybe it was just me engaging in wishful thinking. But I think that you will probably see that in corners like paleoconservatism, right? Like I think to an extent you find it with some of the things that Nick Fuentes says, where he wants to focus on specific issues. The same with Jared Taylor. The same with some libertarians, right? They want to identify something that's wrong and then address that and also support freedom of speech in deconstruction of the political orthodoxies. The problem is that because deconstructive language has basically presented itself as being leftist, I think that they're afraid to articulate fully a philosophy of that. So it's a kind of latent deconstructivism that's almost like Russell Kirk's negation of ideology plus Nietzsche's deconstruction of Platonic universals. So if I think there are a lot of people who maybe sort of subconsciously have crossed Russell Kirk and Nietzsche in their minds and have this sort of idea of an oppositional ideology, or maybe that's just me projecting onto them. But I think that subconsciously it's there. I don't think that the right has really managed to properly articulate a philosophy of deconstruction, which I think it will need to do if we don't at some point down the road want to end up having to deal with a kind of right-wing authoritarian backlash, which might not be entirely pleasant to live under, which I think is absolutely what the left is basically cornering society into doing.
Yeah, I guess, what would you say would be a good start for or rather, what do you think needs to be done to create a right-wing deconstructionist outlook?
Well, I think that there needs to be a sense in which a lot of the visions that are being put forward are unrealistic. And I think that we've done a lot of that on this channel, right? A critiquing neo-reaction, right? The idea of a Catholic medieval theocracy is not a plausible one. The idea of returning to the 1950s, that's not really plausible. The idea of a white ethno-state is not really something that resonates in the mind of most people. So what I would say is that that for the moment, one of the reasons that the right can't get its message across is, I think, because it's basically advocating ideas which would only really be appealing to people if they were reacting to an immediate sense of danger and poverty. But because people are comfortable, they don't want that. And so what I would say is that there are two kind of strategic advices which we might suggest to the right people on the right. We could say they are we could say that one is that if you insist on these constructive visions, you are not going to be able to create unity among the different factions of the right. And you can point to the left and you can say, look, the left is able to do that. They rhetorically, this is why they are able to build alliances. This is why you can't. The left are able to appeal to people's desire for individual expression because they're willing to pretend to be deconstructionists. You are not. This is one of the reasons you can't appeal to modern man. And by the same token, though, you might say that the left has become unappealing in proportion to the extent to which it has become blatantly constructivist. And so you want to play on people's opposition to the left. You want basically a philosophy which is able to frame itself not in terms of a generically nihilistic deconstruction, but that is an ideology whose primary statement is, we will deconstruct the left. And that comes back to, even though I'm not in the habit of quoting him, the William F. Buckley idea of you isolate the source of the chaos and then you work on removing that the way you would a tumor. If you want to avoid, let's say, the least palatable outcomes in society on the right or on the left, then the effort must be the deconstruction of leftist political orthodoxies. And a word of caution would be that the skeptics cannot be trusted alone to do this, because they are not willing to do it, because they themselves are also operating on the basis of leftist orthodoxies like radical anti-racialism. And the level of individualism they support is itself a rhetorical construct of the left. So there needs to be a message of ecumenical, oppositional interest in favor of basically the vandalizing, the iconoclastic vandalizing of the left's sacred cows, and we're going to spray paint all over them.
All right. So we're almost out of time. So what would your final statements be for tonight?
My final statements would just be to, in bullet point form, summarize the basic things that we covered, that all deconstructivism is to some extent left, but the left is not always deconstructive, and indeed the modern left is anti-deconstructive. And unless you are a devout ideologue, there's nothing inherently contradictory about opposing the modern left and even advocating right-wing ideas by utilizing the instrument of deconstruction, which will not only appeal to people who are being agitated by the left, but will also help to mitigate the danger that your side will in turn become positive constructivist totalitarians. That's about it. Thanks for having me on, and I'm glad to have had this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.